Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm excited for week four. This is probably one of my favorite topics is genetics, breeds, and lineages. And so I hope you guys all enjoy. This is kind of background for what we did this past weekend. So we did some colony inspections and our colonies really started growing. So we had a few colonies that had, maybe 8 to 9 frames of brood. So yeah, it's kind of exciting that we're finally kind of entering the beekeeping season. So I'm just kind of curious how everybody else's colonies are looking so far and how they're doing. Yeah, so we want to leave something in the chat that works too. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we'll kind of split this today's session to really two major parts. And so I think I'm going to focus just on lineages and breeds and really what those mean. And then the second part, we'll talk about honeybee genetics. So I know the genetics part can be a lot, so I try to make it kind of more fun and enjoyable. So when we think about, honeybee breeds, genetics, species, I know there's a lot of terms out there. And so I wanted to kind of start off by really defining what these means. So a species is basically sort of a separate, I guess, species of bees, for example. So, honeybees belong to the genus Apis, which consists of several species. So, last week we talked about, Apis dorsata, the giant honeybee. We talked about Apis cerana, the Asian honeybee. We talked about these different species. And so those would be separate species where, they can't intermate or mingle together. And so example of that, with cattle would be, I guess you have Angus and Brahman cattle. Even though they're both cattle, they're actually different species of cattle. And so that'd be example of species. And, honeybees are different species from bumblebees and so on. And so I'll talk about species a little bit more, but there's different species in this kind of Apis genus. And then we have subspecies. So subspecies are different subspecies of honeybees that can actually, mate with each other and pass on their genetics to the next generation. And so with these subspecies, they're often kind of adapted to local environments in Asia, Europe, and so on. And so for subspecies, example would be Apis mellifera scutellata, the Africanized honeybees. Example would be Apis mellifera linguistica, the Italian honeybees. And so these are subspecies, but you can actually hybridize them together to make a hybrid between an Africanized honeybee and an Italian honeybee. So a lot of beekeepers call these races. Race is sort of a complicated term because there's no clear definition of what a race is. And so typically we use subspecies rather than race now. And so if you read a lot of old textbooks, they say, Africanized honeybee is a race, Linguistica is a race of honeybees, but subspecies is a more clear defined term. And so from here on out, I'll use subspecies, but don't get that confused with race. They pretty much mean the same thing. And then we have lineages. So lineages refer to sort of a broader genetic grouping. So some subspecies are more related to each other than other ones. And so as I talk about it, there's lineages like the A lineage. And this includes really all the bees in that Africa area. So like the A lineage would include, Apis mellifera scutellata, Africanized honeybee. It includes Apis mellifera lamarckii, which is the Egyptian honeybee. And so even though they're different subspecies, they're very similar genetically than if they were compared to Linguistica or the Italian honeybee. And then we have breeds. And so a lot of beekeepers, whether you're part of a university or the USDA, or if you're a beekeeper doing your own breeding program, you can develop specific breeds or strains. And so basically beekeepers are taking genetically diverse sources, running a breeding program for specific traits and producing, bees based on those. And so that's really what a breed or a strain or a line would mean. So I'll start with Apis species. So I talked a lot more about this last week, so I won't go into too much detail. But these are the different species of Apis bees. And so we have really the three major categories, like I mentioned, the cavity nesting bees, which would include honeybees. We have the giant honeybees, which is Apis dorsata, and the dwarf honeybees. And so when you think about the cavity nesting bees, these are bees that are living in really cavity nests, right? So bees in their feral environment could be living in a tree, they could be living in a structure, some kind of cavity nesting. And so this include Apis mellifera and Apis cerana, which we know a lot about. Giant honeybees, they don't typically live in a nest. They form these nests on a tree. And so this example of what a giant honeybee would look like versus a dwarf honeybee. So Apis rana, a little bit background about them once again. So they're quite a bit smaller than honeybees, but they're very similar to honeybees in a lot of ways in that they can be commercially managed or managed by a beekeeper in Asia. They do produce honey, albeit not as much honey as Apis mellifera or the European honeybee, but they're also the natural host for, Varroa destructor. And so Varroa destructor, the original host was Apis rana, and then the Varroa basically jumped host onto Apis mellifera or the European honeybees that we manage today. And that jumping happened somewhere around the early 1900s, I think 1920s and 1930s now. But the one good thing about learning more about Apis rana is because they've dealt with Varroa for hundreds and many decades, they've evolved natural defenses against, Varroa, including this intensive grooming behavior and hygienic behavior. So I think we can learn a lot by how Apis cerana deals with Varroa and even some of these other pests and how we can apply that to honeybees. They tend to be a lot smaller. I guess I wouldn't say a lot smaller, but if you compare them to Apis cerana is quite a bit smaller than Apis mellifera, but they also tend to be a bit more defensive, especially when they're disturbed. And here's an example of Apis dorsata, which is the giant honeybee. And so, yeah, these are basically different species, right? So if we compare Angus and Brahmin, those are different species of cattle. These are different species of honeybees. But the only ones that we find here in the US are the Apis mellifera, not the Apis cerana or Apis dorsata. So this is the Apis. This is the giant honeybee, their Apis dorsata. It's the largest honeybee species, and they can reach somewhere to 17 millimeters in length. But they really don't form the nest cavities. They form these hives on tree branches, and they typically only have one single comb of wax, like the hexagonal cells, versus honeybees will kind of make multiple wax cavities on a tree branch or into a structure. They're open nesters, just like this picture, and these can be highly defensive, especially compared to, honeybees, Apis mellifera, or even Apis cerana. So they tend to be more defensive. And one of their major defenses is that shimmering pattern. So I showed a video of this last week where they actually kind of move their whole hive to make this shimmering motion, and that's one way they can deter any predators or any disturbances that are coming into their colony. They also have very specific congregation areas or mating behavior. So, honeybees, the ones that we manage now, they can mate with somewhere between 15 to 20 males, whereas, these giant honeybees can mate with, the queens will mate with somewhere between maybe 75 to 100 males. I mean, they mate with a lot of different males, but they're typically mating in a closer area. They're also seasonal migrators. So when they're really stressed or they have low, I guess, nutrients or resources, they can fly away and find a new home, miles and miles away. Okay, so that's a little bit about the different species of honeybees. And like I said, I talked about that a lot more last week. But today we'll talk about the different subspecies of honeybees and lineages and really what those means and what groupings some of these subspecies would belong to. So when you think about the subspecies, so honeybees are, I guess, known as they're sort of imported into the United States. And so a lot of the bees that we have in the United States were imported from Africa, Europe, and Asia. And so most of our genetics are made up of these importations that started happening, somewhere around the 1500s, ending around the 1900s when the borders became closed. And so most of the genetics and the traits that we see as beekeepers are the result of this importation from these different subspecies. So how many different subspecies are there in honeybees? I think our number right now is maybe 21 or 22 different subspecies. And this is a list of some of them. I know it's sort of in German. I need to make a new graphic of this, but I think it is a really good visual of where these subspecies come from. Actually, this should be subspecies instead of lineages. But yeah, these different subspecies are basically different subspecies of bees that were adapted to a specific area. So, for example, if you look at this yellow, this is Apis mellifera lagusica, which is an Italian honeybee that we commonly manage here in the United States. These bees were locally adapted to kind of that Mediterranean, Italian environment, whereas some bees like Apis mellifera carnica or the Carniolan honeybees were kind of adapted to kind of colder climates, sometimes in the Alps, and so they're more adapted to that region. And so this basically means that if we're looking at these different subspecies in different regions of Europe, Asia, and Africa, they've evolved and acclimated to their natural environment, and they're really locally adapted to that specific area. So if we're buying bees or getting bees from these different regions, they'll have different traits and different genetics based on where they're coming from. And so I'll talk about these in a lot more depth, but if you look at the colors, these are the different subspecies and their native ranges. So this yellow or this orangish color is this Apis mellifera mellifera. This was the bee that was first imported into the United States around 1622 in Virginia. And this was the most commonly managed bee for a very long time until around the 1800s. So for the first 200 years, or about 2,000 years, from 1600s to around the 1800s, most of the beekeepers are managing this Apis mellifera mellifera across the United States. Around the 1860s to early 1900s, beekeepers started importing Italian honeybees or Apis mellifera ligustica. Beekeepers really loved ligustica or Italian honeybees because one, they were less defensive. Two, they had longer tongues, so they could, forage and collect nutrients from a lot of the native plants that we have in the United States. But also, they were just really great honey producers and wax producers. And so, a lot of beekeepers really love this ligustica. The Apis mellifera carnica, or the carniolan honeybees, beekeepers started importing this around the early 1900s, so a little bit after the Italian honeybees. And this was really valuable, especially for people that started moving into the Midwest and so these colder areas, because these are more winter adapted and cold adapted, right? Because if you're kind of in the Alps area, they get some snow, it gets colder, and so if you're migrating into Minnesota, Wisconsin, or so on, the Italian honeybees or Apis mellifera mellifera didn't perform as well, so they started importing carniolan honeybees to help out with that. And so, a lot of these different subspecies were imported over time, but we think about our genetics in the United States, we basically have mutts. And the genetics are made up of primarily Apis mellifera mellifera, which is this orange, Apis mellifera gusica, which is this yellow, Apis mellifera carnica, carniolans, which is this red, and then we have Africanized honeybees in Africa, which I don't have here. But at some point, really all these different subspecies were imported into the United States, but they were kind of outcompeted, and we've lost a lot of their genetics over the past couple hundred years. Okay, so when you think about lineages, right? So these are different subspecies. We have 22 different subspecies, but some of these subspecies are more related to each other than other subspecies. And so one thing we do as, entomologists or geneticists, we try to group them based on how related they are to each other. And so we group them based on these different lineages. So we look at this, these are really the major lineages we have. So we have the M lineages, which is primarily the Apis mellifera mellifera. We have the C lineage, which is basically Apis mellifera ligusca or Italian honeybees, and then Carniolan honeybees. We have the A lineages, which include our Africanized honeybees. L lineages, which would be our Egyptian honeybees. We have, our U lineage, which is basically Madagascar. And so we have all these different lineages. And like I said, I mean, if you go into Africa or Europe or even parts of Asia, one thing you'll know is, the landscape's a lot different, the climate's a lot different, and overall the environment's a lot different. And so these bees had to adapt to these specific regions. And so even though, a lineage may have, 10 different subspecies based on the region of Africa, they have different traits, but they're more similar to each other than if you compare them to C lineage, which is the Italian honeybees and Carniolan honeybees. So these are the different really subspecies of the A lineage, and I like to call the A lineage the Africanized honeybees. So I think we all assume that, there's only one subspecies of Africanized honeybees, which is the Apis mellifera scutellata. We've heard a lot about that, especially dating back to the 1990s when Africanized honeybees first made their way into the United States. But as you can see right here, Africa is a huge continent. There's a lot of diverse regions. Some parts of Africa have mountain ranges, some are more Mediterranean. And so Africa is a huge country, so it's really tough for us to group them all into one type of Africanized honeybee. There's a lot of different subspecies within Africa. And Africa is probably the most diverse area for honeybees. And as you can see here, I think we have 11 different subspecies just within Africa. And so we can't group all Africanized bees as one. There's basically 11 different subspecies of Africanized honeybees. So I'll start with this, and you don't have to remember all this. I sort of want to list out all the subspecies. I know a lineage has a lot more of these subspecies than the other lineages. But we have Apis mellifera unicolor, which is the Madagascar honeybee. And so these bees, obviously, because they're on an island, they're kind of adapted to that. They're kind of isolated and adapted to the Madagascar environment. We have Apis mellifera capensis, which is located in South Africa. These are also known as the Cape bees. And I'll talk about these in the next slide, but these are really cool bees in that they've really kind of pushed out Africanized honeybees or scutellata. And these workers can actually basically take over an Africanized honeybees and make that colony their own. We have Apis mellifera lamarckii, which is our Egyptian honeybee. Now, this was really interesting because this one was imported, but we actually found some of the subspecies genetics in the Sam Houston forest and southern part of Texas. And so we have a little bit of this lamarckii genetics in Texas. And this one actually tends to be a bit more aggressive than the scutellata, which we know a lot about and we hear a lot about in the news. And so maybe if your bees are a little bit more aggressive in the southern part of Texas, they may have some of this Lamarckii genetics. Mellifera geminica, which is the Saudi Arabia honeybee. Now, this was really interesting because they're kind of locally adapted to that desert environment. So it gets really hot in that part of the world. And so these bees are kind of adapted to these extreme hot temperatures and they can tolerate the heat and they have certain sort of heat shock proteins that allow them to, live and survive in that really extreme dry air. Apis mellifera latoria, which is another Saudi Arabian honeybee. If you want to learn more about this, Keegan, the one that spoke to us last week, he's actually going to Saudi Arabia and working with the beekeepers in Saudi Arabia and helping them design breeding programs for this Yemenitica. We have Apis mellifera intermissa, which are bees found in Libya and Morocco. Apis mellifera atosini, which is Madagascar. Saharanensis, which is North Africa. Monticola, which is East African mountains, Simensis, which is Ethiopia, and then we have Apis mellifera scutellata. So this is the one, and this is the one that we hear a lot about the news, and this one's also known as the killer honeybee in the news. And so this was first imported into, Brazil around the 1950s, and then made its way into Texas in the United States around, 1985 to early 1990s. And so this is the one that gets really the lot of notoriety, and this is a primarily subspecies in the United States. But let's all say that, within one A lineage, there's a lot of different subspecies. I think we have about 11. And so, we really can't group all Africanized bees as one. There's about 11 different groupings just within Africa. Okay, so Cape honeybees. So these are the ones found in South Africa primarily, and this is one of the most fascinating species in the world, in that the worker bees can actually lay diploid, female eggs. But similar to honeybees, these workers have kind of smaller ovaries, and they don't have the capacity to actually mate. So one way that they lay diploid female eggs is through a process called parthenogenesis. And so what that basically means is they're laying a diploid egg and they're modifying the genetics of the egg to make that into a diploid. Now these are really cool in that the worker bees, when they start this parthenogenesis, they'll actually fly into an Africanized honeybee, colony. And then that worker right here, this is an example of it, will start laying eggs and take over the entire colony and eventually replace the existing queen. And so what happened is in South Africa, they used to have a lot of Africanized honeybees or Apis mellifera scutellata. And these Cape honeybees have really taken over their nest and really pushed them out of South Africa. And so this is a really fascinating species. I'd love to talk more about them because I think they're really cool with this parthenogenesis. This is the one that we all know, and maybe some love Africanized honeybees, but this is the major subspecies that's found in Texas and certain parts of the United States. They're really known for the aggressive and defensive nature, and so when we think about really defensive bees, a lot of people point to Africanized honeybees. But when we talk about Africanized honeybees, they're part of the subspecies known as Apis mellifera scutellata. And so these are the ones in kind of the southern eastern part of Africa. But one benefit is they're really well adapted to the tropical and arid environments. And so that's one reason that they do very well here in Texas. And that's one reason they haven't moved that far north. Obviously, the migratory nature of beekeeping, there's Africanized honeybees across the United States just because of the importation. But we look at just kind of feral colonies. These genetics don't do as well in the northern part of the United States because they're more adapted to the tropical and arid environments. They also forage really aggressively. And so that makes it really useful in that they're really efficient and they're really great at finding some of these flower resources. And so they can really adapt to really drought conditions. They also tend to swarm more often. So, one reason that your bees may swarm more often is because they have more Africanized genetics. And so, swarming is one way they are kind of adapted to, the viral mites, because if you swarm more often, that really disrupts the mite reproduction and, causes issues with the mites. One thing that Africanized honeybees also have is this intensive grooming and hygienic behavior. And so they're really great groomers in that they can actually find the mites, chew their legs off. They can also have really intensive hygienic behavior. So even though they tend to be more aggressive and defensive in nature, they tend to have a lot of these other valuable traits that beekeepers are interested in. Now, this is not to say that we should be managing, Apis mellifera scutellata, but there's some valuable genetics that could be beneficial to beekeepers in Texas. So around the 1990s, they became hybridized with the European honeybees. So they became hybridized with Italian honeybees and Carniolan here in Texas and started spreading across Texas. And so nowadays you find Apis mellifera scutellata across every part of Texas. Now, how Africanized are honeybees in Texas? I'd say maybe 20% top. I've done some sequencing across Texas and they're never more than 20% Africanized, but that's not to say I haven't sampled all the colonies in Texas. I mean, it's a big state. So, some feral colonies could be more Africanized than other ones. Who knows? And then we had the Egyptian honeybee. And so this is a subspecies known as Apis mellifera lamarckii. It's a small, dark honeybee adapted to the hot, arid climate, similar to really the Apis mellifera scutellata. And so they're kind of in a desert environment, right, in Egypt. And so, they tend to be a little bit more aggressive. They tend to maintain smaller colonies because, larger colonies require more resources. So they're really good at maintaining smaller colonies, swarming more often, and having some of this intensive grooming behavior. They also, swarm and abscond more often than European honeybees. And so, a lot of ways are very similar to, Apis mellifera scutellata, but they tend to be a little bit more aggressive. Now, these were introduced into the United States around the 1862, around the East Coast. I think North Carolina or Virginia was introduced. But we did find genetics in Sam Houston Forest. So nowadays, the only place we find these genetics is, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Now, there's not a lot of genetics from the Egyptian honeybee, but there's some out there. Okay, so we'll get into the old lineage. So old lineage includes the Middle Eastern and Asian honeybees. And so there's not as many, obviously, because Africa is a huge continent, and so we look at just the Middle East and Asian honeybees, it's a smaller area, so there's less bees available. But as you can imagine, the differences in the environment and the climate of the Middle East and Asia is quite different than, Africa. And because of that, these bees have become locally adapted to those specific areas and environments. But similar to Africa, Asia can be a very diverse area. So there can be certain mountain ranges, such as if you look at China, for example, they have certain mountain ranges where the bees have become adapted to that. There's certain parts of South Asia where it's more tropical, like Thailand, for example, we became adapted to that. And so, we can't really group them all into one because there's different subspecies within them. So the one that we know a lot about and one that was primarily introduced in the United States was Apis mellifera caucasica. So this is what we like to call the Caucasian honeybees. There's some people that do still maintain the Caucasian honeybees. I think Bradshaw maintains them and maybe some few other breeding programs. But these are primarily adapted to the Turkey and Armenian environment. We have the Apis mellifera amida, which is Iraqian honeybees. So similar to Saudi Arabia, it's kind of hot, arid environments, and these have become adapted to that specific environment. We have Apis mellifera cypria, which is the Cyprian honeybees. These were basically on this island, the Cyprus island, and so they're kind of closed off from other honeybees. There's not as much, admixture with other honeybee subspecies, and so these have actually have a lot of really valuable traits. And as I'll talk about, these were introduced primarily in the southern part of Florida, and so we have a little bit of genetics left in the United States, but not nearly as much as the Caucasian honeybees. We have the Apis mellifera armeniatica, which is the Armenian honeybee, Anatola, which is a Turkish honeybee, Adams, which is in Crete, and then Palmanella, which is found in the Tian Shan Mountains in China. And this one was actually, well, a little background. So in Washington State, with Dr. Steve Shepard and Sue Colby, they went out into Asia, Europe, and collected a lot of semen samples and cryopreserved those into their cryopreservation tanks in Washington State. And one of them was Palmanella. And one thing they loved about Palmanella was they're really great fruit foragers and pollination for fruit. And so these are really well adapted to apple pollination. And so this subspecies was actually introduced recently to the United States into Texas around 2022. And so I only know of one person that has Palmanella genetics, and they're located in the Beaumont area. And so, that's kind of I could almost be our claim to fame that Texas is the only place that has the Palmanella genetics. Okay, so Caucasian honeybees, so also known as Apis mellifera caucasica, they're native to the Caucasus Mountains. They have extremely long tongues. And so as I talk about some of these subspecies, they have different lengths in tongues. So as you can imagine, if these bees have longer tongues, they can get deeper into certain flowers. And so some flowers, it's really difficult for bees to actually get into and collect the nectar. And so these long tongues make them really great foragers and pollinators, especially for a lot of our native plants here in the United States. So one example of that is, alfalfa. And so bees actually have a really tough time foraging and collecting nectar from alfalfa. And so bees have longer tongues. It allows them to get into those flowers. And so as I talk about some of these other, subspecies, the tongues make a really big difference on how well they actually perform here in the United States, especially parts of Texas. These bees are really prolific in producing, propolis, and so they produce a ton of propolis. And introduction began around 1910 in the United States. I think this was first introduced in Texas in Beeville around 1910, right around that time. And as I get into this, you'll notice that all these subspecies were introduced into Beeville. I think all of them were introduced in Beeville for the first time. And so I'm not quite sure who the beekeeper was, but they must have been just importing a bunch of bees into that area. And so if you're located in the Beeville area nearby, you may have a lot of really unique genetics down there. So the Cyprian honeybees, so like I mentioned, they're native to the islands of Cyprus and Eastern Mediterranean. And so they're really adapted to these kind of hot, dry climates. They're very gentle, but they don't produce as much honey. And so, with some of these lineages, there's some costs and benefits of each one. So this one, like they're really nice and easy to work with. So if you're a beekeeper and you like aggressive colonies, this was one thing that was really valuable to a lot of people. But really the major downfall was they formed smaller colonies and they produced a lot less honey. And so, a lot of people were maintaining colonies back in the early 1900s for honey production. And so that even though the gentleness was a really major benefit, the disadvantage was the honey production and wax production. And so during the 1880s to 1910s, there's major importation of Cyprian across 13 different states. There's some they're really valuable because of their overwintering capacity and their gentleness. And so a lot of people started importing them in the 1880s. But they're introduced into Beeville around 1905. And so it'd be kind of cool to sequence some bees down in Beeville, especially if you find some feral colonies. Because one benefit of this is they're very hygienic and they have a lot of these grooming traits. And so even though they produce a lot less honey, they could be more well adapted to maybe the varroa destructor that we deal with now. Palmanella honeybees. So this one's native to the area of Caucasus and regions of the Black Sea. Um, Yeah, yeah. So it's located in the Tian Mountains of China, but they're very similar to Caucasus, but they're different in that they're really well adapted to pollinating fruit crops, and so there's a lot of apples in that part of the world, and so they're really adapted to pollinating, and they're very efficient pollinators for apples and other fruit crops. And so even though they're really close related to Caucasian honeybees in that they're really great overwintering, they're great groomers, but they also produce a lot less honey. But they're well suited to kind of these temperate climates, and they're introduced to beekeeper in Beaumont in 2022. This is the only beekeeper that's ever had Palmanella imported into the United States that I'm aware of. Maybe they're imported a long time ago, but according to the records and the research I did, this is the only time it's ever been imported into the United States. And so it's kind of curious. I'm kind of curious to see how well this stock is doing, sort of on a commercial level. Okay, so we talked about the A lineage, which is Africanized honeybees. We talked about the O lineage, which is primarily the Mediterranean or the Middle East and into Asia. And then we have the M lineage. So M lineage is kind of that Northern Europe area. And so we think about, Germany, Apis mellifera mellifera came from Germany, and maybe parts of Russia and Ukraine. So around the 1622, Apis mellifera mellifera was first imported into Virginia and into the eastern United States. And this was the primary honeybee managed for the first 2,000 years from around 1622 to around the mid 1850s, early 1900s. And so most beekeepers are managing this Apis mellifera mellifera or the German dark honeybee. The other subspecies of M lineages is Apis mellifera iberiensis, which is native to Spain and Portugal. But I haven't seen any importation events of this. Primarily, the Apis mellifera mellifera was imported into the United States. So this one's really well adapted to kind of cold, wet climates. And so this one was really valuable to beekeepers in the eastern part of the United States. They also tend to be a bit more defensive than Italian or Carnion honeybees. That was one, I guess, major disadvantage of them. They're also kind of darker and more compact. So they're actually a lot smaller. So if you actually compare the German honeybee to Italian honeybee or even Carniolan, they tend to be a lot smaller. But they also have extremely small tongues. And because of that, they had a tough time foraging on a lot of the native plants here in the United States. And so they formed a lot of smaller colonies. They had difficulty collecting a lot of resources, and they kind of they weren't as valuable as Italian honeybees or Carniolans. And so even though these were primarily managed and the only genetics in the United States really in the 1600s to the 1800s, they've been kind of pushed out for some of these other subspecies. So they're first introduced into the US in 1622, but in Texas, they were first introduced in the Trinity River area in Texas around 1821. And so, yeah, this was the first honeybee that was found in Texas that we're aware of. Maybe there's some other species that were there beforehand, but this was the first known importation event of honeybees into Texas. Okay, now we get into the C lineages, which is basically Southern Europe. And so we think about our genetics in the United States, they're primarily from the C lineage. So, in Texas, we might have a little bit of A lineage, which is Africanized honeybees, a little bit of, M lineage, which is the dark German honeybee, but primarily our genetics, about 80 to 90% are this Southern European C lineage. So the first one is Apis mellifera ligustica. This was an Italian honeybee, and importations of this really started around, I think, 1870s, 1880s. And one reason for that is their high honey production. And as I'll show, there was a lot of importation events in Texas because these performed really well in the Texas area. And so because they're well adapted to that Italian area, they became really well suited for Texas specifically. We have Apis mellifera carnica, which is the carnial honeybees. They're native to Slovenia and the North Balkans. And so I actually had a few beekeepers that have gone to Slovenia and looked at their colonies. They tend to produce a little bit less propolis, and they manage them in these kind of giant, really kind of bee sheds. So they're really cool, cool subspecies. But they're also really well. They're actually pretty different from Ligustica. So Carniolan honeybees tend to be I guess darker in color. So this is an example of Italian honeybees. Carniolan honeybees tend to be, I guess, more well suited to the colder climates, so they don't form as large colonies. They tend to shut down in the winter, and they don't go through the honey stores nearly as fast as Logusica. The queens also don't lay nearly as many eggs as Logusica. And so we think about the sea lineage, primarily our bees are this Logusica and Carniolan honeybees. We have in southern Greece, Cecropia, so Apis mellifera Cecropia, which is found in southern Greece, Macedonica, which is also kind of North Balkans, North Greece, and then Siciliana, which is also found in Italy, Italy. And so I don't know nearly as much about some of these other subspecies. As you can tell, I'm not doing as many descriptions. But these are also not imported into the United States that I'm aware of. I didn't see any records of these imported. It's primarily Italian honeybees and Carniolan. Okay, so our Italian honeybees. So one major benefit of Italian honeybees is they're known for being very docile and easy to work with. And so a lot of beekeepers have hybridized Italian honeybees with some of these other stocks to get less aggressive and more docile honeybees. They're also really great at building up. And so these Italian honeybees tend to build really large colonies and they tend to brood up really quickly, especially in the winter. And so that can be a benefit or even a disadvantage. So here in Texas, when we have kind of these warm spells throughout the winter, those warm spells really cause the Italian honeybees to begin to lay eggs, start brooding up and building up really quickly and potentially going through their food stores. And so that can be problematic when you get those cold spells and they ran out of their honey and syrup to make it through the winter. And so there's a benefit for them, growing really fast and building up because it helps them produce a lot of honey. But their downfall is their ability to, make it through the winter, especially if they're brooding up and going through their honey stores. A lot of beekeepers actually also like them because they produced less propolis. They're also more prone to diseases. So, they grow really large, they have high honey production, but they're more prone to a lot of these diseases and pathogens, and especially varroa mites. They were introduced into Texas around 1881, and so I saw reports in introduction in Uvalde area, Beeville, and even kind of let's see, kind of parts of Houston. So we have the Carnion honeybees, so the Apis mellifera carnica. These are also very docile, similar to the Italian honeybees. One advantage, they have this rapid spring buildup. And so with Italian honeybees, they tend to form large colonies and overwinter in small colonies. These ones tend to fluctuate in their size. So they tend to form really small clusters going into the winter, but once the spring hits, they brood up really quickly. And so they're really great at taking advantage of their early nectar flows. And so this is one bee that I think a lot of beekeepers like to manage here in Texas because of that rapid spring buildup, especially here in the spring. They tend to be a bit more cold hardy, and they're very efficient at conserving their food stores. So Italian honeybees, I guess, aren't very efficient at storing their food stores because they form these large colonies, but these are really great at overwintering. And so a lot of beekeepers, especially in the Midwest, keep these bees because they can hoard a lot of honey and they have a better ability to make it through the winter. They also have a higher tendency to swarm, and so you might see these bees swarm more often. So they were first introduced into the United States around 1877, but in Texas, they were introduced in San Benito, Texas in 1910. And so we definitely have a lot of bees that are Carniolan background. And so a lot of beekeepers are either raising these in Texas or purchasing these bees in California or other parts of the United States. Okay, so this is I showed this graphic last week, but this kind of shows the different importation events across the United States. And so when early settlers first came to the United States, starting around 1622 into the mid 1700s, bees were imported primarily for wax. And so wax was used for a lot of religious ceremonies like the Catholic religion, Protestants, and so wax was really valuable. And so I think a lot of people thought that bees were imported for honey, and honey was a really great, I guess, sugar resource and it's a really good sweetener for a lot of people back in the 1600s. But a lot of bees were primarily imported for their wax production. And so starting in 1622, around this kind of Virginia area, getting into Maryland, modern day Maryland, um, the Apis mellifera mellifera or dark German honeybee was introduced. And so primarily all these introduction events right here around the 1600s to 1800s, these were all Apis mellifera mellifera or the dark German honeybee. And so as you can see all these different importation events from the East Coast around the 1600s into the 1800s as early settlers started moving farther west. Now, as we can see, once things hit around the 1800s, right? Once we had sort of around the Louisiana Purchase and people started moving farther and farther west into parts of the Midwest, started settling into parts of Texas. You can see that the temperature is a lot different versus the East Coast. And so beekeepers wanted to import, bees that perform better than the dark German honeybee. And so around the mid 1800s, they started importing primarily, Carniolan honeybees and Italian honeybees. And so starting around, if you get to around this area, once you have kind of this striped line, this is when Italian and Carniolan honeybees were starting to be introduced. And so this yellow is yellowish, this darkish color, this is primarily Apis mellifera mellifera. Now, if you look at Texas, these are different importation events of Apis mellifera mellifera. So it's imported first in Texas in 1831. But I actually saw earlier reports, I think 1821 in Beeville, but then in West Texas, kind of around that Dessa, San Angelo area, this Apis mellifera mellifera was introduced around 1845. But in Texas, around the 1880s, the Italian honeybees and Carniolan honeybees were first introduced. But as you can see, I mean, within a few hundred years, bees have spread across the entire United States, including Texas. So these are the primary bees that were introduced into the United States. So we all know and love the Ligusica, which are the Italian honeybees. So like I said, these were introduced around the 1870s, 1880s. They're really great honey producers and also very docile. But now we know that they're more prone to a lot of diseases and pathogens. And so there's some cost and benefits with Italian honeybees. Carniolan honeybees, so these are more adapted to the cold temperatures. They tend to rapidly build up in the spring, but they also tend to form smaller clusters in the winter. And so they're really a great bee to work with in parts of Texas and even into the Midwest. We had the black bees, the dark German honeybees. So, like I said, these were first introduced in 1622 and the primarily genetics of bees. But these have been kind of watered down and eliminated by primarily the Carniolan honeybees and Italian. I very rarely see Apis mellifera mellifera genetics anymore, maybe 10%. So it's very, very low now. We have Apis mellifera scutellata, which is the Africanized honeybees. These were introduced into Texas around the 1985, 1990s. And then we have the Caucasian honeybees, which were introduced around 1910. And just kind of show a little timeline of the different importation events. I guess I want to show the first time they were imported. Some of these subspecies were imported at multiple times in Texas, and so I just kind of put the first time they were imported. If you want more information about their importation events, I'm happy to share that with you. So the first bee that we know of that was imported into the United States was the dark German honeybee, which is Apis mellifera mellifera. It was imported in 1822 in the Trinity Valley area. In 1881, Italian honeybees were first introduced into Texas in the Beeville area around 1881. And so this is right around the time when the Texas Beekeeper Association was formed. You had a lot of these giant bee suppliers come to Texas, such as the AI Rip Company and other parts. And so at that time, they started selling and distributing bees that were Italian honeybees. Apis mellifera cypria, or the Cyprian honeybees, were introduced into Beeville around 1905. And and you can kind of see a theme here. I actually looked at the history of Beeville. It actually has nothing to do with honeybees, but it's kind of funny that all these importations were happening in Beeville. It's actually some lady, her last name was Bee, so they called the area Beeville. But it kind of became this epicenter of beekeeping around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the beekeeper, I don't know exactly who, but they started importing a lot of these different subspecies around the 1900s. And so, yeah, around Beeville, 1905, the Cyprian honeybee was introduced. I very rarely see any of these genetics. I don't know Beeville that well, but there might be some genetics out there in feral colonies. They also introduced Apis mellifera carnica or carniolan honeybees in Texas in 1905 around Beeville, and then Syriaca in 1905. And so, as you can see, we have a lot of these different importation events here in Texas around 1905. I haven't done any sequencing, but be curious to see if these genetics are still out there in Texas. But I'm guessing this beekeeper is probably importing a lot of bees because right after 1905, um, we sort of had a closed border, and so importation really stopped around 1920, I think. And so most of the importations were happening at this point. And this is also kind of aligned with the growing bee in industry across the United States. And at the time, Texas was the biggest sort of bee industry was in Texas around the 1900s. And so it was a major producer of colonies. It was the number one honey producer in the 1900s. And so it was a really valuable place for beekeeping. And then we have the one that we all know and love, Apis mellifera scutellata, which was first found in Hidalgo in 1990. So yeah, this is kind of outlines the different importation events here in Texas. Okay, so what are bees, right? I mean, your question is you're buying bees from either a local beekeeper or you're buying queens from different parts of the country. What are your bees? Are they, primarily M lineage, which is the dark German honeybee? Are they primarily C lineage, which is Italian and Carniolan honeybees? Or are they primarily A lineage, which is primarily the Africanized honeybees? Okay, so I'll kind of walk you through this graphic, and this is one where we see, I guess, how much of a mutt is your bee? I mean, that's kind of that's sort of the best way I can describe it. And so these are pure lines, right? So if it's all one color, this is a pure line of bee. So as you can see, it's 100% all green. So this means that this bee that we sequenced in Germany was 100% Apis mellifera mellifera or the German honeybee. This is C lineage. So this is primarily the Italian and Carniolan honeybees. So as you can see, we sequence bees in Italy and then 100% C lineage or Italian honeybees. We have A, which is Africanized honeybees, and they have O. So these are all pure, right? Because we're actually sequencing them directly from, their native ranges in Asia, Europe, and Africa. Now, if we look at these different bees, and because I would love to sequence different bees across Texas. These are just part of common breeding programs, but it'd be cool to have some sort of project where I collect bees from different beekeepers and see because how much a mutt are your bees and what are the genetics of your bees. So this is Minnesota Hygienic. This was a beekeeper located in Mississippi. They're basically selecting for this Minnesota Hygienic trait, which I'll talk about. And so we sequence those, and as you can see. I see about 50% are this C lineage. And so this is primarily Italians and Carniolans. They have about 20% of this Apis mellifera mellifera or dark German honeybee. And then maybe a small sliver, this orange and blue, which are Africanized honeybees, which is maybe 5 to upwards to 10%. We look at the Hilo breeding program. So this is a breeding program done in Hilo. It's basically a hybrid of Italian honeybees and Poline honeybees. And as you can see, about 80% of the genetics are Italians or Carniolans. And so, I mean, you can see all this gray across the board. Most of your bees are probably a mixture of Italians or Carniolans. We look at the green, maybe 10% are the German honeybee, and then maybe less 5 to 10% Africanization. Italian honeybees, which makes sense, the ones that you purchase from California. So I think this is a producer in the northern part of California. 80% of genetics are Italian or Carniolan, which makes sense. 10% the dark German honeybee, and then maybe like 5%, which is Africanization. Poline is a breeding program done in Baton Rouge. So they started this breeding program around the mid 1990s. Like I said, most are Italian or Cardiolan, a little bit of the dark German honeybee, and then a small sliver of Africanization. So they don't have a lot of Africanized genetics in their stocks. Now we get into the kind of interesting one, the Russian breeding program of Saskatraz. And what's interesting is they have more Africanizations than some of these other stocks. So as you can see, primarily it's Italian and Carniolans, which is this gray, but there's a little bit of the dark German honeybee, but not as much. But you look at the Africanization, which is the orange and the blue, they have, somewhere between, 5 to 25% Africanization. So this might be one reason that Russian honeybees are a little bit more aggressive. They have more Africanization in their stocks. But Saskatraz, this is a breeding program done in Saskatchewan, which I'll talk about, but they started with a bunch of different stocks. And so they have a little bit of Russian in their genetics. They have some Italian, Hilo, and so sort of a mixture of all these different things. But really, the biggest takeaway here is that I guess all your bees are mutts. You don't have any pure stocks in the United States, even ones that claim to be Italian. They're probably a mixture of Italian and Carniolan. But primarily, the genetics are going to be this mixture of Italian and Carniolan genetics. Okay, now we get into breeds and stocks and lines. And so some of you may be part of a breeding program or have your own breeding program, or you're purchasing stocks from other reputable breeding programs. So these are some of the different breeding programs that I know of here in the United States. There's probably a lot more that I'm missing here, but these are the ones that are really well known that have had a lot of success with their breeding program. So we have Saskatraz, which is a breeding program done in Saskatchewan by Albert Robertson. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but they distribute a lot of stocks in Canada, but there's also a queen producer in California that maintains and selects for Saskatraz. And so in the United States, you can actually buy some of the Saskatraz genetics. Now, I will say that these were imported quite a few years ago now, I think 5 years ago. And so a lot of the genetics have probably been watered down over time, so they're not the same pure line as they were originally in Canada. The Russian breeding program, so this started at the USDA facility in Baton Rouge, but there's a whole Russian queen breeders program, primarily located in Mississippi, where they kind of maintain these Russian stocks and distribute them to beekeepers across the US. The mite biters, so this was a breeding program done at Purdue University where they started with primarily pole line and Italian stocks and a little bit of Russian and selected for this mite biting behavior. So it's, Russians, these bees were imported from part of Russia and they're maintained that way. Whereas the mite biters was basically a trait selected program where they're breeding for one specific trait, which is mite biting behavior. So they're looking for how many mites were chewed off by the bees and selecting based on that. Pole line. So we've heard a lot about pole line, and it was a breeding program that started in 1995 to combat, bees against Varroa destructor. So this actually started as a VSH line. So they started selecting for Varroa sensitive hygienic line, but beekeepers hated that. They really loved that they were mite resistance, but they didn't produce nearly enough honey for beekeepers. So what they did was they took that VSH lime and they crossed it with that Italian line to produce pole lime. And so pole line just stands for pollination line. So they call it pole for short. And so this is a really nice bee to work with in that they're one really great honey producers. They're more docile, so they're getting those genetics from Italian stocks, but they're also resistance from that VSH selection program. But yeah, actually, I will note that the pole line started with the Russian stock, and so the Russian stock was highly selected for VSH, and then they did a hybrid with Italian stocks. Minnesota hygienic, this can mean a lot of different things. So this is where we go out to the field and we do hygienic tests for beekeepers. And so any bee can be selected for Minnesota hygienic behavior. So you can start with Italian, Carniolan, you can start with mite biters, and you can select for Minnesota hygienic. And so a lot of beekeepers, especially in East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, select for Minnesota hygienic, but their stocks can vary based on what their original stock was. Buckfast was a breeding program done by Brother Adam in the Abbey, and he selected for honey production and yield. At that time, he wasn't really focused on varroa resistance. I mean, the selection program was basically more for American foulbrood and some of the issues they faced back then. But a lot of beekeepers loved Buckfast because they were really great honey producers and really nice and easy to work with colonies. But they didn't have as much capacity to deal with varroa mites. And so what Saskatraz basically did was they took Buckfast and selected and added varroa resistance to it. And then we have the Hilo breeding program. So Hilo breeding program was started by Project Apis mellifera and the USA facility in Baton Rouge. And it basically wanted to make a more commercial stock and distribute these stocks to beekeepers across the US. And so pole lime was originally brought into Hilo, Hawaii, along with Italian, California Italians into Hilo, Hawaii. And so Hilo is basically a hybrid of pole line and California Italians. And so here Hilo is basically a hybrid of pole line. So with these different breeding programs, and if you're interested in starting a breeding program, we'll talk about this in 3 weeks or so. But these breeding programs are looking for very specific traits. Now, if you go back to before the 1990s and before the introduction of bromites, a lot of the breeding programs were focused on honey yield and resistance to American foulbrood. But now a lot of the breeding programs are ultra focused on bromites. And so some breeding programs are focused on grooming behavior where the bees can, find the mites and chew their legs off and groom them. Some are looking for SMR, so suppressed mite reproduction. This is very similar to VSH, where the bees have the capacity of disrupting the mite reproduction and cause them to be sterile or infertile. Some breeding programs are focused on hygienic behavior, so they want bees to be more hygienic and be more resistant to a lot of diseases and basically have a cleaner colony. Some are adding resilience, so the ability to overwinter and be locally adapted to specific environments. And so when you think about parts of Texas, it's really wide range, right? The environment in West Texas is different from East Texas, and so you want your bees to be resilient and great foragers in your specific part of Texas. And so a lot of beekeepers are taking some of these stocks and making them locally adapted to the specific area. And then obviously a lot of beekeepers want yield, right? I mean, if you're a commercial beekeeper, you're looking for high honey production and high yield. And so yield is always and usually number one priority for a breeding program. So when you think about a breeding program, what's really important is that this trait is heritable and there's genetics associated with that trait. And so one way we see if this trait is heritable is we look at this heritability estimate. Now, if you're not familiar with heritability, it ranges from 0 all the way to 1. If a trait has a heritability of a 1, for example, that means genetics are playing the primary role in the trait. So example of a heritability that has a 1 would be eye color, for example, where there's certain genetics that are associated with brown eyes versus blue eyes, and the environment plays a very, very small role in heritability. If the heritability has a 0, that means genetics isn't playing a very big role in that trait. And so if a heritability has a 0, then the environment's playing the role and the genetics is playing a very small role. And what that basically means is the smaller the heritability, the harder it is to breed that specific trait. Now, all traits have a little bit of a heritability, but what you want is a high enough heritability so it makes it easy to breed and select for that trait. And so if a beekeeper is interested in selecting for grooming, SMR, hygienic, resilience, or yield, they want to make sure that that trait has a high heritability so they can breed for that trait. But if it does have a low heritability, it might take, 5 years to select for that trait versus 1 year. So these are the different heritability estimates for different traits that you may be interested in as a beekeeper. So this line is basically the optimal breeding point. And so for a beekeeper, you want traits that are above this because it's easier to select and breed for those traits. And so, if you're looking for a trait that has a heritability above, this 0.25, then that means it might only take you 2 to 3 years to select for these traits. But if it's less than this, it might take you maybe 5 to 10 years. So it takes a lot longer. So heritability for all these different traits. So as you can see, the only two traits that are below the heritability line is Varroa jelly production and Varroa defense. Now, Varroa defense means a lot of different things. It can mean grooming, it could mean, VSH, Minnesota hygienic. And so some of these are higher versus lower, but primarily the Varroa defense traits have a lower heritability, so they're a lot harder to select for. But as you see, most of these traits have extremely high heritability. So, I mean, what that basically means is genetics plays a really important role for honeybee traits, and it's really easy to breed and select for a lot of these traits. And so we can easily breed for, intensive swarming. We can breed for pollen collection. We can breed for fertility, like male and queen fertility. We can breed for less robbing by honeybees. We can breed for higher honey yield and wax yield. More defensive behavior. This is a really heritable trait. So we can breed for bees that are less aggressive and less defensive. And then propolis. Propolis has a heritability about a zero point 0.8. And so this is an extremely easy trait to select for. So this all means that when you think about genetics of a honeybee colony, we think about how heritable that trait is. So we can breed and select for that. And so as we get into the breeding section, we'll talk about this a bit more and how to design a breeding program to select for some of the other traits that have a low heritability. Okay, so one breeding program was the Purdue Mite Biters. So this breeding program started at Purdue University around 2000, 2001, I believe. And the goal was really to breed a bee that was resistant and adapted against Varroa. And one thing that these researchers found out was if you go to Apis cerana or you go to Africanized honeybees in Mexico and Brazil, they didn't have to they were sort of adapted to Varroa. They didn't have Varroa issues and we didn't have to treat or manage them. And one reason that they were resistant to Varroa was this mite biting behavior, so this intensive grooming. And so this is a picture of this grooming behavior. So this bee actually picked up this real mite on the back of this other bee and started chewing it with their mandibles. So honeybees have the mandibles, right, that are kind of like scissors and hands that allow them to kind of cut the legs off and chew the mites and kill them off. And so they started breeding for this intensive mite biting behavior, intensive grooming behavior to help them deal with a resistant stock. And so over time, and I think it took maybe 7 years to breed for this trait. This is when the trait has a low heritability, so this one took a long time. But they started with maybe 10% of the mites were chewed to all the way up to 50% of the mites were chewed. And over time, with this breeding program, they have resistant stocks and they haven't had to treat or manage mites very, very rarely. Okay, so you have pole line, which is a pollination line. I'm gonna mute. Okay, hope that fixed it. Okay. We have pole line, which is the pollination line. Um, and pole line started at the USDA ARS lab in Baton Rouge, and it started with the Russians. So Russians were first introduced into the United States because they had to deal with Varroa for an extremely long time. And so these Russian honeybees had these natural defenses really against the Varroa. And so what they did, and what they found was they had this trait called Varroa sensitive hygienic behavior. And what this basically means is the bees can actually sense the mites inside the brood cells. And so when the mites are feeding on the pupa, for example, those pupa give off a very specific pheromone. The bees can smell that pheromone and they start uncapping the cells, and that disrupts the mite reproduction. And so this has been a really valuable trait. And so what they started doing was take those Russian bees and started breeding and selecting for a varroa sense of hygienic behavior. And then once they had that, beekeepers, I guess they sort of realized that they weren't great honey producers. They were really great at dealing with Varroa, but they didn't produce nearly as much honey. So they made hybrids between Italians and their VSH stock. But yeah, this VSH means that they can detect and remove, mite-infested brood. They can slow down, Varroa reproduction, and this has improved colony health. And so when I did my postdoc at the Baton Rouge Bee Lab a couple years ago, and I worked with these stocks for a long time, but we never had to treat them. This is a really great trade, an easy trade to select for, and it's a really great way to have Varroa resistant stocks. And one reason that your bees might be resistant to Varroa, and one reason you might have low Varroa levels over time is because they have a mixture of this grooming behavior, so the mite hunting or mite biting, and this VSH behavior. Okay, then we have the Hilo breeding program. So this was started really not too long ago. I think 2015 to 2016. And so one problem with pole line was this is managed. The pole, I'll kind of go back. One issue with pole line was it's managed by the researchers at the USDA Bee Lab in Baton Rouge. Now they're not commercial queen producers, so even though they distribute some of these stocks, it's really hard for them to get these stocks into beekeepers' hands. And so what they needed to do was start working with a commercial queen producer so they can, really begin selecting for these stocks and distributing to beekeepers across the US because the USDA really doesn't have the capacity to. I mean, they can maybe sell, 100 to 200 queens per year, but that's probably maxing it out. And so to sort of get around the issue, they formed this Hilo breeding program. And so they teamed up with a commercial queen producer that produces queens in Hilo, Hawaii, and they brought Poline to his stocks. They hired a bunch of people and they started breeding for this new Hilo stock. And this Hilo stock is basically a mixture of, Poline, which has a VSH, and then California Italians. So they want to make them better honey producers. And so yeah, it's been kind of up and down with the breeding program. So it's one thing where it's really hard. You can have a breeding program, but once you start selling their daughters and F2s, you lose those genetics really quickly. And so, a lot of beekeepers, don't see the value in this stock as much as they should, but we're kind of working on how to improve this and get these stocks into the beekeeper's hand. But I think the concept of it is really great. And we really need to find a way to get these real resistant stocks into beekeepers' hands. But Project Apis mellifera, which is a nonprofit, they really support and they expanded the Hilo program across the US. And then we had the Russian breeding program. So this was initiated by the USDA Bee Lab around the 1990s. And this was really the first major initiative to breed stocks against Varroa into the United States. And so in this region of Russia, the Primorsky region of Russia, these bees have really coexisted with the Varroa for over 150 to 200 years. And because they became sort of adapted and acclimated to Varroa mites, they developed a lot of these natural defenses. And so one thing with grooming, when they went to Russia and brought them back to the United States, these Russian honeybees had really intensive grooming behavior and more intensive VSH behavior, and they had this tolerance and resistance to Varroa. And so the USDA Bee Lab in Baton Rouge brought this down to Baton Rouge, formed a queen breeder group, and started distributing these stocks across the southern United States into parts of the United States. Now, some of you may have some of these Russian stocks. I'd make sure to get it from a person that's part of the actual association. So some people market their stocks as Russian, but they're not actually part of the association and not getting their stocks. And so I really like these stocks, but make sure you get it from the actual association because I bought Nooks from a beekeeper that claimed they had Russian bees, but they're not actually getting it from the pure line. And so it's really important to try to get those pure lines because those ones will have the traits and have the genetics you're looking for. Now, if you do, maybe leave in the chat if you do maintain Russian lines. A lot of beekeepers say that they're a bit more aggressive and they tend to be a little bit more aggressive, but I don't think they're actually so bad. I thought they're easier to work with. But if you compare them to Italian honeybees or Carniolans, they tend to be a bit more aggressive compared to those stocks. And then we have the Minnesota Hygienic. So this is sort of a trait-based selection program. So you can do this on any type of bee you have. So if you're buying bees, Italian honeybees or Carniolans, you can select for this very specific trait. So Dr. Molly Spivak, she was at the University of Minnesota and actually just retired a few months ago. She developed this Minnesota Hygienic breeding program to improve disease resistance. Now, when I talk about hygienic behavior, there's different types of hygienic behavior. So we have VSH and we have grooming behavior and mite biting. Now, this is a whole different grooming behavior, and these are more targeted due to viral mites. This hygienic behavior was more targeted due for diseases and brood pathogens. And so if you select for this, you're not going to have viral resistance, but you can have resistance to chalk brood, European foul brood, American foul brood, and some of these other diseases. And so what happens is what Marlis developed was she froze 300 cells with liquid nitrogen and they killed all the brood in this area. She put it back into the colony for 24 hours later and then came back to see how many of the dead bees were removed. Now, this is an example of a colony that's not very hygienic. As you can see, after 24 hours, only 63% of the cells had all the dead brood actually removed, whereas the other, 37% didn't have the brood removed. So if you're selecting for this, this is one that you might not want to breed from and select from. But if it's all these are removed, then this colony tends to be more hygienic and really better at dealing with diseases and brood diseases. And so any beekeeper can select for this. It's pretty easy. You don't necessarily have to do liquid nitrogen. You can actually take out a frame or cut out part of the frame, put into the freezer, put it back, and do it that way. So it's a really easy trait to select for. But like I said, this is a trait-based selection, meaning that you can select based on bred on Italians, Carniolan, or really any other honeybee stocks. And then we have Saskatraz. So Saskatraz was a breeding program initiated in Saskatchewan, Canada by Albert Robertson. He has a sort of a background in animal breeding, and he's one of the best breeders I would say in the world, and I've really loved working with him. And he run this really great breeding program, and his goal was to combine all these different traits that beekeepers are interested in, such as high honey production, disease resistance, and more importantly, varroa tolerance. Now, when he first started his breeding program, he started with a really diverse genetic pool. So he started with Italians, Carniolan, Russians, and Buckfast. And one reason he did that was because they all have certain traits that, beekeepers are interested in. So Italians are really gentle and great honey producers. Carniolans are really great at overwintering, which is important for Canada, but they also are really great at brooding up in the spring and really targeting some of these foraging. He took Russians, so Russians have some of these Varroa resistant traits such as grooming and VSH. And then Buckfast is really valuable for the honey production and gentleness. And so he wanted to fix all these different traits into one bee, and he called it Saskatraz. So this is widely distributed across Canada, but he started working with a major queen producer in California and started distributing Saskatraz that way. And so I'm not sure, has any of you purchased Saskatraz or tried Saskatraz? maybe not. So I know, so Sandra mentioned, yeah, Sandra has five. Kimberly, oh, you said Kim's never used Saskatraz. Yeah, I've never tried the California Saskatraz. I've gotten them directly from Albert, and I'm actually getting some here in the next few months to try them out. Um, but yeah, one thing with the California guys is they got the original line maybe 5 years ago, and so over time, if you're not doing a proper breeding program, you can lose those genetics really quickly. So I'm not sure how pure they are anymore. And then we have Buckfast. So Buckfast was first developed by Brother Adam in the early 20th century. And so he's probably one of the best breeders of all time. And he has really great books and resources. So I highly recommend, reading his research and his breeding program because he had one of the best and I suppose one of the first and most successful breeding programs in the world. So what he did was his breeding program involved crossbreeding various European strains, and they're really known for this hybrid vigor. So what that means, if you take certain pure lines, they're kind of inbred in a way. So if you're taking lines from Italy, they're kind of inbred in that specific region. But so if you cross them together, that increases genetic diversity of those lines, and that makes them have more of these different traits. So because he was in Europe, he was getting a lot of these pure lines out of Europe. And because they're kind of more inbred and they're more pure, he started crossing them together and formed this really great stock. And they're really known for the high honey production and gentle nature. They're also known for their efficient spring buildup. Now, the question is, can you get hybrid vigor if you decide to run your own breeding program? Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you're doing a breeding program where you know, you're closed mating, so you're doing insemination, you're lowering the genetic diversity, and then once you have those open mate, um, I guess at the end of the season, then those can increase genetic diversity and have some of these other valuable traits. So one question I get all the time is genetic diversity an issue in the United States? We've heard a lot of reports, over the past 30 years, and a lot of people talk about how genetic diversity is really low in the United States is a big issue and one of the major reasons for colony losses. And so I looked at the genetic diversity between these ancestral lineages. So these are bees that were native to their region of Europe and Asia and Africa, and I compared the genetic diversity to some of the breeding programs we have in the United States. So nucleotide diversity, this is the metric we use for, genetic diversity. So basically what it means is if that number is higher, these have higher genetic diversity. If it's lower, it has lower genetic diversity. But as you can see, the A lineage, which is Africanized honeybees, the C lineage, which is Italian and Carniolans, M lineage, which is German, and so on, they actually have a lower genetic diversity than these breeding lines. And remember, like the pole line and helo, these are all closed mated stocks, result of insemination. And so even though we're closed mating them and we're doing insemination, they actually have a lot higher genetic diversity than the bees that were found in their native ranges in Africa and Europe. And so this kind of means that, genetic diversity is actually really high. And one reason that we don't have as much real resistance to some of these traits is because genetic diversity is almost too high. So we think about a breeding program, what we want to do is depress genetic diversity at those specific regions to have those traits. And so genetic diversity might be one of the issues we have in the United States. But this also means that because we're taking all these different stocks and breeding together, that management and that mixture of these pure lines is actually increasing the vigor and increasing genetic diversity of these breeding lines. Okay, perfect. Well, so I think that's it for this first part. And so I think we'll take a 10-minute break and come back at 10:25, and then I'll come back and I'll answer any questions that anybody has.
We have tons of questions in the
Okay,
in the
perfect.
chat.
I'll start putting these all into the Q&A and then I'll start going through some of these.